So I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker. This is Gary Chappell with us today. I've worked with Gary over the past year because he spent some time as our point person at the Census Bureau for the ACS Data Users Group. He's currently the project lead for the ACS Content review process that is underway at the U.S. Census Bureau. So the American Community Survey is the nation's largest household survey. It provides detailed social, economic, housing, and demographic statistics for large and small communities. The Census Bureau, as many of you know, is in the process of reviewing each of the questions on the ACS to make sure that the survey includes only those questions that federal agencies need to accomplish their missions. Census Bureau also wants to minimize the reporting burden on the 3.5 million households that respond to the ACS each year. So Gary is going to talk about some of these issues, the Census Bureau's goals and approaches, their outreach to data users, and the next steps in this process during 2014.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I suppose depending on where you're calling in from, it might still be morning, but good afternoon or morning to you. As Mark said, I'm the project lead on the content review that's occurring on the American Community Survey. And I'm speaking today on behalf of our office chief, Jim Treat, who conducts the American Community Survey. So I'm particularly pleased to be talking today to a group of data users because you understand the survey, you use it heavily, and you appreciate its value. And so therefore, you're very important stakeholders to us. And we really view you as the lifeblood of the survey. So on that note, I'd like to flip to the content slide and simply tell you that I'm going to walk through briefly some background as to how we got to today on the content review, talk a little bit about the approach to the content review, describe the methodology that we're following, and then conclude the conversation with a couple of slides that talk about the feedback mechanisms that we're putting in place for survey respondents and for data users such as yourselves. I think at the end of our session, I've got a couple of suggested questions, but primarily I'm interested in hearing what questions you may have that come up through the course of the presentation today. So turning to slide 3, which is our background slide, I wanted to start it out by talking about a little bit of recent history. About 3-4 years ago, by December of 2010, the Census Bureau really was able to begin a comprehensive assessment of the ACS program. By that point, the ACS program had been fielded long enough where we had a fully mature program, and it was the logical point to stop and see what are we doing efficiently, what are we doing not quite as efficiently as we should be. So taking stock and looking top to bottom at the program and trying to determine is there anything we could be doing better. So at that stage, we launched what we call a program review, not the content review on the topic today, but an earlier program review to really evaluate all the processes involved from the full life cycle of the ACS. And that resulted in a lot of areas where we realized we could make some improvements and efficiencies in the program. And so moving forward in time, by the time we reached the summer of 2012, the Office of Management and Budget then initiated a process whereby it asked federal agencies to confirm and update the information that really drives the information that's on the ACS, really the under-the-hood statutory and regulatory authorities that establish questions on the questionnaire itself, and what are the uses that the ACS data that are collected put to by those agencies. So that was sort of a progression of, we're looking at the program, we're revalidating the information that exists on the form, and then concurrently with that, if we're moving down to the third bullet, a little bit later in the summer in 2012, there also was the formation of a subcommittee of the Interagency Council of Statistical Policy. I know that's a mouthful, but the ICSP, also an OMB spawned group. And their specific mission when they were formed regarding the ACS was, as you see the quote here, ensure that the survey provides the most useful information with the least amount of burden. And the reality is, though, at the end of the day, when the information was collected by the federal agencies and provided to the Census Bureau, we realized that that process really had not truly gone far enough. It still left some open-ended questions about associating the uses to which the data are put with the original legal basis cited in the public law, for example, that places that question on the survey. So our final bullet here is concluding with the notion that the next logical step was that we really did need to step back once again and conduct, this periodic scrubbing to revalidate and go a little deeper with more detail to ensure that we had sufficient justification to validate keeping all the questions on the survey. So that, in a nutshell, is the background to where we are today. So moving to the next slide, I'd like to just touch on for a minute or so the approach that we're taking. Now, as you can imagine, and certainly you're the folks who particularly can imagine because you use the data so heavily, that this is a challenging project. I mean, when you're looking across the terrain of all roughly 40 topics that are on the ACS, which further breaks down into 72 questions on the form, 48 of which are person questions and 24 are housing, and then you further look at the, disaggregate that into the subparts to those questions, you're talking about quite a bit of material to re-examine. So we are realizing as we've gone into this that this is a really large thing to do, and we have quite a number of agencies and sub-agency components, as you would imagine, that utilize the data. So we're probably talking, on the magnitude of at least 4 dozen entities within the federal government that utilize ACS information collected in one form or another, either through some statutory need or a regulatory need, or simply because the program requires that type of information. So what our approach now is to begin this process with an initial focus on several key measures. And on the slide we're saying difficult to measure topics. And what we really mean by that is topics that in some way or form are found to be in some way troublesome for us to collect, meaning perhaps they're perceived as overly burdensome by the responding public. They might be considered rather sensitive or in some way intrusive. Why do you need to know this information from me? And isn't there another place in the government that information is collected, so why are you asking me this here on this survey, that sort of thing. So this led to focusing on the 4 topics you see on the slide. And if you've memorized the form, or if you happen to have a copy of it in your office or in your head, the plumbing facilities question is really housing question 8, parts A, B, C, and D. And the journey to work question is really a series of questions, person questions 31, 32, 33, and 34. Moving down, the income questions are questions 47 and 48, but question 47 has 8 different parts to it. And then finally, the disability question is actually 2 questions, 3 questions, person questions 17, 18, and 19. So again, through various mechanisms, through conversations with stakeholders such as yourselves, through correspondence, controlled or uncontrolled, that we receive either through Congress or through private citizens, we get a lot of feedback on these topic areas. And when I say a lot, I don't mean thousands upon thousands, but then in some cases dozens or up to 100 per year type pieces of correspondence that might come into the Census Bureau about these particular topics. So how are we grappling with this? So what we've done as an agency, we've put out an official request up through the Department of Commerce, which I believe you would know is the parent organization of the Census Bureau. We've reached over to other cabinet-level departments of the federal government and requested that there be a central point of contact for that department assigned to this effort. And we did that last month, and we are in the process right as we speak of collecting the points of contact back from the organizations. I will tell you that 22 letters went out in that capacity, and we've had responses confirmed back on 18 of those, and the remaining 6 we're still chasing down. As you can imagine, the left-hand, right-hand, in large organizations, it's sometimes difficult to get the information rapidly, but we are, I'm glad to say, able to say that we've at least made initial contact with all of those entities. Now, moving down the slide here, the next bullet point has to do with how do we get started? How do we kick this off? So we have pulled together a summit, we're calling it, on the content review with federal agencies, and we're going to be conducting that as a one-day, really general introduction to the content review and concluding with discussions specifically about these 4 topics. We're holding that meeting on Tuesday, April 29th, downtown in Washington, D.C. at the Department of Commerce main auditorium. And I'm sort of harping on that a little bit as I talk because, you as stakeholders, certainly many of you would have direct connections with federal agencies that use ACS data. So we're trying to go wide and talk to all our stakeholders about the fact that we're doing this to ensure that the right people are at the table. We need to make sure all agencies are fully engaged in this process. Without that full engagement, we might not be able to fully support the needs of that agency. So if the agency is absent, that's a problem because we really need to fortify our detailed documentation in support of the question being on the form. So I guess what I'm doing is making a pitch. If you are passionate about this and you have connections in the federal government, we may know about who those folks are, we may not. And so your assistance could help us in reaching out to them. So moving down the slide to the next bullet, that, of course, that kickoff summit is to kick off this information gathering phase for the content review. And so really the several months following the April 29th kickoff, the slide says June, but this will very likely go into July, we will continue to sit down and have direct one-on-one conversations with the agencies who are vested in this process. We will be in receipt of materials from those agencies to work through to validate those uses and ensure we have the proper documentation moving forward. And then that moves us into the analysis phase. So as the information comes in, we will certainly begin the analysis, and all of that with the intention of looking forward to making content decisions in the summer-fall timeframe of 2014. And then that takes us to any decisions we might come out with. There would need to be the formal announcement process of a change to the form through the Federal Register notice, which would occur as a 60-day announcement in the period October-November. And that would, the outcome from that would be the implementation of decisions. Really, this says calendar year 2015, but in truth, we actually need to get a leg up on this as early as October of this year, because it's a 15-month cycle to affect change in the production of the ACS in the field. So if we want to have any changes on the questionnaire that is fielded in the 12-month period for 2016, we're going to need to start that process as early as this coming October. And I know I've harped on the 4 topics that we're starting with, but I just wanted to not leave the impression that we're leaving everything else behind. We're very much doing this as a top-to-bottom assessment of the survey. So all 72 questions, all 40 topic areas are on the table. It's just a matter of the ability and the resources to work through all that. So I just want you to not lose sight of the point that we will be working through this process with all topic areas, not just the ones we start with. So moving forward to the next slide, which I believe is slide 5, this is our methodology. So as the slide says, to evaluate ACS content, to determine which of those variables are the most valuable, we're using this cost-benefit analysis approach. And as the 2 sub-bullets depict, cost is really the difficulty in obtaining quality information from the field, and benefit is the usefulness and quality of the data. So the cost, again, gets into things like the, is there a perceived high burden on collecting this on the point of view of respondents? Is it overly sensitive? Or is it hard for the Census Bureau, utilizing its field staff, to go out there and obtain answers for non-respondents? And then benefit is things like we really can get good quality of the data down to low levels of geography, since of course you know that that's what the ACS is all about, is data for small areas and small populations. And especially given the fact that nobody else is out there collecting this information. So concluding on this slide, we've identified and selected decision criteria that fit into these 2 categories. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, but when you look across the federal terrain, we have close to 200 identified known uses of the data across those 4 dozen or so federal agencies. So moving on to slide 6, this slide has to do with the decision criteria that we've built up to do as much as possible this through a very considered scientific process, where we are indeed looking at 19 overall decision criteria. 13 of those would fall into the category of measuring the utility and quality of the variable that's on the form, whereas 6 would measure the difficulty of obtaining the information. So the Census Bureau is going to rely on federal agencies to provide information for about 1/3 of these criteria. And we, the Census Bureau, will provide the information on the remaining criteria. So what do I mean by that, the remaining criteria? That breaks down into about 1/3 of those remaining criteria are the so-called paradata about the data. These are the things such as the non-response rates for the items, other things like how long does it take, now that, especially now that we have the internet option, how many seconds does it take to answer that question? So we do have metrics, we have collected together that information. We're actually doing that as we speak, but that will play into the decision criteria. And then the final third, of the remaining criteria, the other thing we're doing is we are reaching out to our actual field data collection staff. We have field representatives out in every county of the country all the time, and we have we have interviewers in our contact centers who conduct the callbacks to seek answers to non-responded questions, as well as sometimes an individual may call up for help in filling out the form, and the result of that phone call might be collecting the information from the form in that phone call. So we have about 1,100 field staff or interviewers in contact centers that we're going to be going out to and asking them from their own perspective, how difficult is it to get answers to particular questions? How much difficulty do they feel that respondents have in answering to those, and sort of some probes like that to understand better from their perspective. So moving forward to slide 7, this is actually giving you the 19 decision criteria that I spoke of. The left side, of course, is the utility, and the side being the difficulty. So the left side is the 19, and if you look at those a little more carefully, you can see they cluster just a bit. The first 3 are statutory, tied to a statutory use, whereas the next 3 are tied to a required use, and then the final 3 are a programmatic use. And you can see there's a progression within each of those clustering sets of 3 bullets. Is it at the block group tract level? Is it at the place county MSA level? Or is it at the state national level? And that all factors into weighting and scoring of how significant the utility of that question is. And then the remaining utility factors, which include, as you see there, the county level interquartile range in values, that the variable is used to select a frame for another federal survey. Might there be other data sources that exist alongside the ACS where that information could be pulled, and median county level coefficients of variation? How wide or narrow are those? And then turning to the difficulty side, you can see that these are, I believe, fairly intuitive. The cognitive burden on the part of the respondent, is it very understandable how to answer this question? Something I keep touching on is there sensitivity around that question. Is there just an overall complexity to that question that makes it difficult to answer? Again, the number of complaints the Census Bureau might receive on that, the seconds to answer, and the median item response rate at the county level. So moving further, we can see now sort of a visual example of how we might approach the application of these decision criteria to any particular question. And so this is strictly notional, but you can see that of the 4 quadrants in the graph, the scatter plot of questions, is draped across this. It would really be that lower right-hand quadrant that would be the telling quadrant for us. So that's where you're seeing the questions that are rather difficult to obtain answers on. And in terms of looking across the federal landscape of who is utilizing that particular datum for X programs, the utility is coming out to be fairly low. Not a whole lot of folks are using that particular item for a whole lot of uses. So I think this speaks for itself, as you can see here, everyone will have somewhat different perception of the value of the question, but we're trying to impose some rigor to the process of making these determinations. So if you now move to slide 9, these next couple slides have to do with mechanisms that we're putting in place to assist with obtaining feedback on the questions. So number 1 here, I think both of these feedback mechanisms would be interesting to you as data users. This one is perhaps the more general one, where anyone who's a respondent in the survey, and frankly, for that matter, anyone in the public who so chooses, could provide feedback on using this feedback mechanism. We're intending to launch this little tool next month, and it really boils down to the 3 questions here you see on the page. First of all, we're trying to understand, just to frame a context for this, is the person that's supplying these comments, have you been you or someone in your household, have you ever been in the ACS? And that could be through any of the pathways, online, by mail, by phone, or through an in-person interview. And then secondly, do you have comments? We're trying to be very neutral here and just say, if you have some comments, please let us know. And there's just a quick link to pulling up the form if they would like to remind themselves, oh yeah, that was question 14, that was the one I didn't have a good experience with, for example. And then the third question here is there anything else you want to talk about? And we're just giving some examples about, things around the act of collecting the data. So, comments about the materials that told you that the survey was coming, did you have any trouble accessing it online? What was your experience like interfacing with the Census Bureau employee who contacted you, etc.? And there's free-form text for them to give that information. So moving on to slide 10, this slide and the next slide perhaps are actually of a little more detailed use to you, and I encourage anyone who's listening, tell your neighbor who uses ACS, please feel free to fill out this form. This one will come online a little bit later, probably, I'm hoping, early June. It's very doubtful it'll be the end of May, but probably early June. And we're really seeking here feedback on the highest valued questions. So the way we go into this is we're setting you up with the information to be able to respond to up to 5 questions. So, the form has got a lot on it, so we tried various approaches, but we ended up with kind of this, the way you see it here. We've got 4 top-level clusters, the social, economic, financial, physical questions, and then depending on where your interest is, you can roll down to a second level, and then when you see the actual topic you're interested in, you roll down one more time and you get the actual wording of the question, and then you can select, and I believe we have this set up where you can even select the subpart of the question. So if you move over to the slide 11, this is the remainder of this feedback tool. So you've got the questions 2 through 5 here. The question number 2 is, and you would iterate through this for up to 5 questions. Tell us how you use this question. Is ACS the only source, or do you have another source? And if it is the only source, is it the primary source? And lastly, why is ACS your primary source? I mean, in some cases this might be obvious, it's the only game in town, but there could be administrative records you could also use, or whatever else is the case. So we would really like to understand that in detail. And then number 3 is if you have any additional comments about any of these questions, please let us know that. And just so we, again, can understand the context of how the information is coming in, what's your affiliation. And then lastly, but not least, if you are interested in highlighting for us some of your uses, we would be all over that. We always are looking for very concrete, demonstrable projects or examples, programmatic examples, what have you, that demonstrate the value of the ACS. So with that, I'm to my final slide, and this is questions for discussion. I would say that probably more apropos is whatever's come up in your mind as I've been talking that you would like to send forward as a question. But just to stimulate the conversation, I've put a few things down here on the page. You know, what is your reaction to these 4 topics we're beginning with? Might there be others that you would be interested in having at the top of the list to be looked at? You know, in terms of the decision criteria and the process we're following there, how would you rank or rate the different utility versus difficulty scores? And then lastly, I'm a shameless, making another shameless pitch here to, if you do have any case examples, we would love to hear about them. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I turn the floor back over to Mark.
Great. Thanks very much, Gary. Since I guess I have the mic right now, I wanted to start with one question that I had. And I guess it's related to the different, you're collecting feedback from a variety of different places. And I know you're starting with federal uses of ACS data. You're going to try to collect information from survey respondents, and then there are data users who may or may not have received the questionnaire and filled it out. But I wondered how, since you're going to have all of these data from different places, how do you go about weighting those different responses you get from data users versus federal agencies? Do you know how that's going to work at this point? Is there a process for sorting through all of that information?
Well, thanks for that question. It's a very good one. That it will be a challenge. We are resource limited on our end, so simply purely being able to parse through open-ended questions where concerns may be voiced or come back in through various feedback mechanisms will have a bit of a challenge even to evaluate what we have. To the extent that they can factor, we can do that, and it can factor into some of our decision criteria, such as the ones especially on the difficulty side, the cognitive burden, the sensitivity, the overall difficulty, number of complaints. We will certainly make every attempt to weigh that into those factors. It's a little bit hard to anticipate the the passion out there, how many people are going to actually respond to us. Mm-hmm. It could be, hundreds, it could be potentially thousands. That does remain to be seen. But I would end with just saying that that's important to us, and we'll certainly be making every effort to include that as part of the process.
Okay. Someone asked if there's a report that would be available on you mentioned an ACS program review that took place before this next process of the content review, and is there a report available on some of the results of that program review?
There absolutely is. It's a public-facing document. It's the final report of the program review, and if you provide me the information on how to send that out, I will certainly send the individual that information.
Okay, I can do that. Does the ACS include any topics that are not specifically directed or required by federal law?
Well, that's a really good question. My short answer, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a deep knowledge expert on all questions, but the short answer would be there is a legal basis behind every single question on the form. Now, some of these legal bases go all the way back to the beginning of census taking and used to or evolved into being on what we used to call the long form, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which was the ancestor to the ACS. So the more you look, the more you find, and even with the 4 topic areas we're starting with, there's a deep, long history with those questions on previous, earlier censuses. A number of the long-form questions emerged in 1940, but some go all the way back to the beginning of the census. So I guess I don't have a real specific answer beyond saying that in some shape or form there is a legal basis for everything that has come onto the ACS and that will remain on the ACS. I know that in conversations, the office chief, Jim Treat, has made the point that we have to be careful because just because there is a legal basis for a question, that is not 100% guarantee that will stay on the form. I mean, you know, times change and the relative value of different questions change with it. And if you want to talk about the example of the plumbing facilities, not to, you know, pick on that area or anything, but we do get a lot of questions about why do we ask about flush toilets. And, you know, certainly in earlier decades in the previous century, it was a far greater likelihood you would come across households that did not have indoor plumbing. And that was one aspect of plumbing that was very important to certain programs that deal with substandard housing or grants to householders. So, you know, moving forward in time, increasingly we have a much higher percentage of households that have flush toilets. So one could argue, at least relatively speaking, that the value of that question has diminished. Not to say it's still not important in some sectors, and certainly in certain regions and American Indian reservations, for example, in certain parts of the country, that might be a very important question. But in terms of the overall, you know, value of that question stacked up against other questions, it may not be as high, and therefore, you know, going back to the legal basis for things, we need to examine from the various dimensions to make sure that we have a strong legal basis and a continuing value of, in receiving or asking for that information, so that we can still walk the talk of trying to minimize burden on the 3.5 million households that we go out to per month, per year, I mean.
Will the data users know who the various points of contact are from the various agencies?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
The POCs, will that be made public, who the POCs are, the points of contact from the various agencies that will be involved in the summer discussion?
I don't see why not. We're still compiling the list, and we certainly want buy-in as broadly as we can get it. So I'm sure that we can make that available. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then one person had a comment which I think you sort of already addressed to some extent, but it's basically that if you focus primarily on federal agencies, there's this person notes that you'd be ignoring some of the other important users. For example, if the journey of work data is obviously used extensively in planning mass transit, and it's often done at the state and regional level. So I guess that's just a comment.
Well, it's so funny that came up because just this morning in a prior conversation just before this webinar, those of us in the room that care about the Journey to Work question were bringing that to the fore, that while at the federal level, the DOT is a federal level, but there are 300 to 400 metropolitan planning organizations around the country that greatly care about the information collected, because that's bringing it down to the level that they need to see in the local environment. So we're very cognizant of that, and in our outreach, we do, while the statute on the books, is federal, we still understand that the funds are allocated down to the local level. So we want to make sure that we are connecting the dots and that those conversations are happening as we work through the Journey to Work question.
Okay. Someone asked if all of the topics in the ACS would be on the table and not just the 4 cited, and I think as you mentioned, it's true that any of the content could be on the table at this point.
That's right, Mark, and not that we're going to pause, but we're going to take stock after we go across the summer, fall time frame, and understand how our process has been playing out for these 4 topic areas, and fold back in any tweaks or feedback into the process, so that as we go out for what likely would be the next round of topics we would want to address, we're a little bit smarter, and so we're going out a little bit more effectively and efficiently to reach those. But the bottom line is, yes, we're intending to go across all topics.
Okay. How will the data user feedback forms be made available to folks? I mean, I can say in terms of the data user community, we can certainly provide people with links to that if it's made available online. Are there other ways that you plan to disseminate that?
Well, I guess I didn't really make a very good point about that, did I? Both of these tools are web-based tools, so they're going to live on the Census Bureau's American Community Survey website. And I don't have the URL right on the tip of my tongue. In fact, on top of that, we're redesigning our website, the Census Bureau is. So I wouldn't want to give you the wrong link, but in effect, the respondent tool will be very high up, I think on the top landing page for the American Community Survey. And the data user tool will be a little bit further down on a landing page that talks specifically about the content review. And I can certainly follow up and send you the intended URLs for both those links.
Okay. Someone mentioned they think that there's a specific need to connect federal and user input, especially around the Journey to Work and other items that might be more likely to be used locally to respond to federal requirements.
Yes. Again, as this process plays out, the goal would be that there'd be a certain degree of organic quality to this, that as the folks who are most heavily involved reach out to their constituents and the stakeholder group, will grow through word of mouth, if not through direct communications, once we find out who the right people are to be communicating with. So I do see this as being not just top-down, not just bottom-up, but both of those, and reaching deeply into organizations so that those who have the most vested and knowledgeable documentation for us can be at the table or their voice be heard.
Mm-hmm. Someone raised the question about the income question, which they note seems to be one of the most important variables that's asked in the ACS, and they're asking whether the intention is to modify these questions or to drop them entirely from the ACS questionnaire.
Well, I mean, the overall goal of the content review is to scrub the questionnaire. Are we asking the set of questions that are the most effective to be asking that are the least amount of burden for the responding public? I mean, I guess that's sort of my mantra. But the content review specifically is not per se about rewording the question, but we do want to look at the way we're asking the question to make sure that is the most effective. And I'm not trying to be waffly when I say that, but one outcome could be that we launch some research into looking at the way we're asking that question. The outcome of the content review that for this first round with the income on it might be that, you know, we're not going to drop anything, for example, but we do want to put that into more of a research mode so that we can understand if there's a better way to be asking for this information. I mean, every day we also have conversations with various folks about what about the use of administrative records. You know, can we get this information in any other way? So that's always on the table as a question to be asking as we move through this. You know, are any of the, not just income, but anything on the form, is it a candidate for replacement by an administrative record? That's a speculation on, you know, my part as I say that, but I'm putting out there that no holds barred. We're looking at, you know, if survey X over here happens to be asking something very similar that we're asking, or maybe it's the union of the two things, they're asking something, we're asking something else, and you put those together and you get the full picture. Does that mean we should redesign how, or drop it from the ACS and ask it in a more complete way on the other survey? Things like that. So we are trying to approach this from an open mind of what's the most effective way to move forward.
Then there's a couple questions from data users, I guess folks who want to have more of an opportunity to weigh in on specific topics. So one person asked if there's any other way, if there's a way other than the online tool that's going to be released in June for non-federal data users to express their uses of ACS data. And then someone else mentioned, is there a way for data users to work on helping to build the quality of certain questions that are being asked in the ACS? So if a question was dropped or modified, would ACS data users be able to help in that process of redefining the questions?
Well, those are broad questions, but on the first part, I mean, even the data user group, the DUG itself, through its own mechanisms and affinity groups, could be a potential forum to further the conversation about content review. And you know, we're certainly closely aligned with DUG, so we would get input that way. Also through other mechanisms that we have are the state data centers and the census information centers, and you know, a variety of stakeholder groups that we go out to on a regular basis to have that conversation. So I guess through your affiliations, that is a mechanism to bring that forward to the attention of the Census Bureau.
Yeah, and for those who don't know the DUG acronym, it's an unfortunate acronym, but it stands for Data Users Group, and that's the online community that PRB and Sabre Systems established as a forum for ACS data users to talk about issues just like this one.
Yes.
Let's see, just a couple, we have time probably for just a couple more questions here. Have you thought about using this as an opportunity to educate people about why a question is being asked? For example, a congressperson may not know why journey of work is being asked on the form and the fact that it's needed.
Well, that's a very good question. We have a lot of activity going on in the communications realm for the ACS, and we've been undertaking some research to improve our communications about mailing packages we send out to respondents to make sure they don't throw it in the trash and that they understand it's a mandatory survey, but not be hit with a sledgehammer over that you must respond. But in terms of Congress itself, we're doing a lot of outreach lately to actually the bottom up, the staffers that work for the congressman, to educate them more, provide them with training on the ACS. And the content review is one of the hot topics right now. So we are trying to work that pathway as well, that to try to close, if there is a disconnect at the top level, that the congressional staff are able to bring forward the value and the understanding of the survey for that congressional district. And as I think most of you know, we have my congressional district tool on the website now, and various things like that. So yes, that's been on our minds, and we are definitely attempting to address that.
Okay. And then finally, a couple people asked if it would be possible to get copies of the presentation you gave today. Would you be willing to share that with folks?
Well, I certainly believe I am. This is a public, communication, so I guess I'll work that out with you, Mark, how to get that out to folks.
Sure. Yeah, what I can do is, I saw some other folks have asked for the results of the program review, so I think we could, I might be able to provide both of those documents. The presentation and the program review to participants in today's webinar.
Sure, yes, I'll get that to you.
Great. So with that, I want to thank Gary again for taking the time to talk to us today, and I want to thank all of our participants. We will be in touch about the next webinar, which will be coming up. We're going to be conducting actually a presentation at the upcoming Population Association of American meetings. We hope to record that session, which will provide a broad overview of the American Community Survey. So we'll make that available to anyone who's interested in that information. So that concludes today's webinar. Any final words you wanted to say, Gary?
No, just thank you again, Mark, and thank everyone who was listening in and for those great questions. And we look forward to working with you on the content review.